In this lecture, I'll go over transformation orientations, which are just different ways that you can move, rotate, and scale things. For this, we have a menu of options up here, and you can also access a pie menu of these options by pressing the comma key over the 3D view. Now, the transformation orientation is set to global by default, and that means it will use the global axis as the reference. So when we move things along the x-axis, it uses the global x-axis, and same thing with the y and the z-axis. And even if we rotate the cube a little bit and we press G and then X, it's still moving it along the global x-axis. But we can switch this over to the local axis instead. And we learned more about local axis in one of the last lectures. I think it was called global axis versus local axis. So if you watch that, you kind of understand where I'm going to be going with this. So I switched that to local axis. And just for a visual, in the object properties, I'm going to turn on the local axis display for the cube. So you can see the local x-axis is pointing at a diagonal like that, instead of being perfectly left and right like the global axis. So when this transformation orientation is set to local, and we press G and then X to lock movement to the x-axis, it's locking it to the local x-axis. Now I do want to reiterate something that I mentioned in the global versus local axis lecture. We can actually keep the orientation set to global. That way if we press G and then X, you can see it's going to lock the movement on the global x-axis. If we press X a second time, it's going to switch over to using the local axis. So we can actually toggle between them. And that works for rotation and scaling as well. Like if I press R and then X twice, you can see it's rotating on the local x-axis instead of the global x-axis. So instead of switching over to local, you can actually double tap the axis and use that hotkey to switch between global and local. All right, let me get rid of the cube here and I'll add in a plane for the next example. And let's switch over to the normal orientation now. Now this is more for edit mode, and it's going to take the direction of the face, which is called the normal, and use that direction for transformation. So for example, I'll go into edit mode of the plane here, and let me rotate that randomly like this. And let's say I want to move this plane along the direction that it's facing. Well, I'll simply press G and then Z, and it moves it along that direction. So it's like the face has its own axis. I can even press G and then Y, and it moves it perfectly sideways like that, or X, it moves it like that. Alright, let me get rid of this and I'll add back in a cube. And let's move on to the gimbal orientation option now. So there are different ways of rotating objects. The default X, Y, Z rotations are perfectly fine in many cases, but if you want to animate rotations, then you'll often want to use something called Euler rotations. And the gimbal transformation orientation can help with this type of rotation. Lee goes much deeper into this topic in the animation section and can do the explanations way more justice. So if you're curious to learn more about this, then I would check out his lectures on animation. So right now we'll just move on to the view option here. And this is pretty simple. It's going to perform transformations based on whatever view you're in. For example, if I rotate the view like this, I press G and then X, it's going to move it perfectly side to side relative to the view. Same thing with G and then Y. It's going to move it perfectly up and down relative to the view. And G and then Z is going to move it front to back based on the view. So this is actually really handy, especially if you're creating things like a GUI, for example, and then you can go into camera view and you can move things perfectly left and right or up and down in order to arrange all the elements for the GUI. Now let's move on to the last option, which is cursor. And this could come in handy if, for example, we wanted to move something along a slanted surface. For example, if I wanted to move this cube along this slanted surface here, what we would do is first align the cursor with the surface, which I've already done, and you'll learn more about snapping the cursor to surfaces in the snapping tools lecture. But now that we have the cursor's axis aligned with this face here, we can use that to move this cube around on this surface. So with the cube selected, I'll press G and then X. You can see I can move it side to side on that surface. I'll press G and then Y. I'll move it up and down, and it still is aligned with the surface. And then G and then Z moves it into or away from that surface. And that pretty much does it for that. Any rotation the 3D cursor has is the axis that all transformations will be using. And now let's go over the very last option, which is this plus sign right here. And what this does is it creates a custom transformation orientation based on your selection. So we have the cube selected right now. Let me enable visibility of its local axis there so we can see how it's rotated. So when we click that plus sign, it's going to save this exact axis orientation, and we're going to be able to use that as transformation axis for anything in the future. So let's go into the menu and click on the plus sign, and it saves it under cube, which is the object's name. Now we can use this exact orientation to move anything that we add into the scene. So let me add in a UV sphere. I'll scale it down and put it on the surface of that slanted surface there. And now when I press G and then Y, you can see I'm moving it based on the axis of the cube. And G and then X, and then G and then Z. So you can actually save custom transformation orientations by just selecting any object that you want to use, and then click on the plus sign, and it'll save that orientation, and then you can use it later to do any editing. So if you find yourself needing to transform along a particular custom axis a lot, you may want to save it by using that option so you can keep using it. And that's actually going to do it for all the transformation orientations. We'll be using the default global option the most, so I'll keep it set to that. And that's going to do it for this lecture though, so I'll see you in the next one.